A doctor refused to treat an 8-year-old boy because he was the son of a poor waitress. Days later, he discovered that something terrifying was happening in his house, and he realized that his decision had almost cost the boy's life. The sun had not yet risen over the Pine Grove housing complex, but Sarah Miller was already adjusting her waitress uniform in front of the stained mirror in the small bathroom. At 32, her face revealed the serenity of someone who had learned to face adversity with faith and determination. Her hands, slightly rough from constant work, straightened the Sunshine Diner badge as her eyes turned to the small crucifix hanging on the peeling wall. A brief, silent prayer escaped her lips, as she did every morning before starting her day. The 2-bedroom apartment she called home wasn't much, but it was enough for her and her 7-year-old Tommy, who was still sleeping peacefully in the room next door. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, mingling with the aroma of toasted bread she was preparing for her son's breakfast. "Tommy dear, it's time to wake up," Sarah called softly, entering her son's room. The small room was decorated with colorful drawings pinned to the walls, most depicting superheroes and astronauts, dreams that Tommy shared with her every night before falling asleep. The faint light coming through the window revealed a brown-haired boy, his hair tousled, buried under an Avengers blanket. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, tenderly running her fingers through her son's hair. "Mrs. Johnson will be taking care of you today, remember? She promised to make that mac and cheese you love so much." Tommy slowly opened his eyes, a sleepy smile appearing on his angelic face. "Mum, can I take my new car to play with Billy today?" he asked, referring to Mrs. Johnson's grandson, who often kept Tommy company during the long hours Sarah worked to support them both. The morning routine continued as usual, with Sarah preparing breakfast while Tommy got ready for another day. The old television murmured local news at a low volume, serving as background for their conversations about the day's plans. "Remember to do all your homework before you go play," Sarah instructed, watching her son devour his strawberry jam toast. "And don't forget to thank Mrs. Johnson for lunch. The apartment might be modest, but it was permeated with the love and dedication of a mother who worked tirelessly to give her son a dignified life." The thin walls couldn't contain the sound of Tommy's laughter as it echoed through the space while he told his mother about a funny dream he had during the night. Sarah checked the clock on the kitchen wall, 6:45 in the morning. In 15 minutes, she needed to leave to catch the first of 2 buses that would take her to the diner downtown. Her shift started at 8, and she couldn't afford to be late. The manager had been clear about the rules, and she needed this job more than ever, especially after Tommy's health insurance had expired the previous month. As she packed her son's lunchbox into his Avengers backpack, Sarah made a mental note to review the health insurance paperwork during her lunch break. The overtime hours she was putting in at the diner could affect Tommy's medical coverage, and she couldn't risk being without assistance for her son. It was just one of the many worries that kept her mind occupied as she balanced the month's bills. Mrs. Johnson's timely arrival at 7 o'clock brought with it the familiar scent of lavender and the warm smile that had been part of their mornings for the past 2 years. The 65-year-old woman was like the grandmother Tommy had never known, treating him with a warmth that warmed Sarah's heart. "Don't worry, dear," Mrs. Johnson said, noticing the concerned expression on Sarah's face. "He's in good hands. Go to work without a care." Sarah hugged Tommy tightly, kissing the top of his head. "Be good, my love. Mommy will be back before dinner." The boy waved cheerfully, already engrossed in his toys scattered across the living room rug. The day unfolded normally at Mrs. Johnson's apartment. Tommy had finished his homework and was now playing in the housing complex's playground under the watchful eye of the elderly woman knitting on a nearby bench. The afternoon sun was beginning to lose its strength when everything changed. In a matter of seconds, the sound of children's laughter was replaced by screams. Tommy had fallen from a considerable height, but unlike what would be expected, he wasn't crying. He showed no signs of pain. "Mrs. Johnson ran to him, her heart pounding in her chest, finding the boy sitting on the ground, curiously looking at the scratches on his arms. "Tommy, my God, Tommy, Mrs." Johnson's voice came out broken by her panting breath as she knelt beside the fallen boy. The other boys had formed a silent semicircle, their eyes wide and fixed on the scene. Tommy was sprawled on the dirty sand, one arm injured, deep scratches on his knees and elbows. What chilled the old woman's blood was not the sight of the injuries, but the expression on the boy's face, an almost scientific curiosity as he observed a red stain trickling down his forearm. There were no tears, no screams, no expected reaction from a 7-year-old child who had just fallen from a height of over 2 meters. "Does it hurt, dear? Where does it hurt the most?" she asked, her wrinkled hands trembling as they hesitated over the small body, fearful of causing further harm. "It doesn't hurt at all, Mrs. Johnson. Look, my arm looks weird, doesn't it?" Tommy replied with a calm voice, turning his head to face his own limb, which was visibly injured from the fall. He used the same tone he would use to comment on an unusually shaped cloud or an interesting insect found in the garden. The contrast between the visible severity of his injuries and his absolute calmness sent waves of terror through the elderly woman's body, and she quickly fished her cell phone out of the pocket of her faded cardigan. Her fingers, normally slow and hesitant with technology, dialed the emergency number with desperate urgency, while keeping her eyes fixed on the boy who was now trying to sit up, seemingly oblivious to the pain he should have been feeling. "Emergency, what's your name and address, please?" The female voice on the other end of the line sounded professional and controlled, a counterpoint to Mrs. Johnson's quickened breathing. The words poured out in a cascade from her trembling lips, her voice wavering between panic and an attempt to maintain composure so as not to further frighten the children watching the scene with wide, fearful and curious eyes. "Edith Johnson. I'm at the Pine Grove Housing Complex playground on Westbrook Avenue, number 437. A boy, Tommy Miller, 7 years old, just fell from the big playground equipment. It must be about 2.5 meters tall. He's badly hurt. His arm looks broken or dislocated. He's scratched all over, but there's something very wrong. Very wrong indeed." The attendant continued with her protocol questions, her trained voice aimed at extracting essential information amidst the emotional chaos. "Is the child conscious? Can he breathe normally? Is there any heavy bleeding anywhere?" Mrs. Johnson confirmed that yes, Tommy was conscious, breathing normally. The bleeding didn't seem severe, but her voice broke as she tried to explain what truly disturbed her. He's acting like nothing happened. He's not crying, not complaining of pain. He's looking at his injured arm with curiosity, like he's watching an interesting cartoon on TV. I've never seen anything like it in my whole life. There's something terribly wrong with that boy." A brief, heavy silence followed her words, as if the attendant herself was processing the strangeness of the situation. When the voice returned, there was a different urgency to its tone. "Ma'am, don't move the child. An ambulance is being dispatched to your location right now. Keep him lying down. Talk to keep him conscious, but don't let him get up or try to move his arm. Stay on the line with me until help arrives." Mrs. Johnson nodded, momentarily forgetting she couldn't be seen by the attendant, and then murmured her agreement as she turned towards Tommy, who was now poking curiously at one of the deep scratches on his knee. The ambulance arrived in under 8 minutes, its red lights silently spinning in the late afternoon. The siren switched off as soon as it entered the housing complex. The paramedics approached with quick, confident strides, carrying equipment and a small stretcher, their professional expressions masking any initial reaction at seeing the boy's condition. Mrs. Johnson took a step back, still holding the phone to her ear, as she watched the younger man kneel down beside Tommy. "Hey, champ, my name is Michael. Can I take a look at those injuries?" His voice was gentle but firm, his dark eyes quickly assessing the extent of the visible damage. "Sure. Look, my arm is all twisted. Funny, isn't it?" Tommy replied, his childlike voice carrying a disturbing innocence given the situation. The paramedic exchanged a significant look with his middle-aged female colleague, whose face transformed into a mask of professional concern. "Does it hurt when I touch here?" Michael asked, gently probing different points on the visibly dislocated arm. Tommy simply shook his head no, watching the proceedings with a typical childlike curiosity, but with an utterly atypical calmness for the situation. The second paramedic approached Mrs. Johnson, who was hanging up the phone with trembling hands. "How long has he been like this? Not showing any pain?" The female paramedic asked in a low voice, so Tommy wouldn't overhear, as her colleague continued examining the boy. Mrs. Johnson shook her head, confusion evident on her age-lined, now tense features. "Since the fall. He didn't scream, didn't cry, nothing. It's like he can't feel. Is that normal? Could it be shock?" The paramedic frowned, her trained eyes turning back to the boy who was now animatedly showing the other first responder one of the superhero drawings on his blood-stained shirt. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." This isn't a normal reaction, even accounting for shock. The ambulance's arrival at the community hospital was met by a medical team already alerted to the unusual situation. Tommy's calmness contrasted sharply with the apparent severity of his condition. The doctors exchanged puzzled looks as they examined the boy, who answered their questions with typical 7-year-old innocence. "It doesn't hurt at all, doctor. Can I go play now?" The medical staff was perplexed. How could a child who had suffered such a fall be so calm, showing no signs of pain or discomfort? Sarah arrived at the hospital in a state of panic, still wearing her coffee-stained restaurant uniform, her crooked name tag dangling from her rumpled shirt from her frantic dash. Her silent prayers echoed through the sterile white hallways, mingling with the distant beep of heart monitors and the muffled murmur of medical conversations as a kind-faced nurse guided her to the room where Tommy lay. The characteristic smell of hospital disinfectant invaded her nostrils, further intensifying her growing anxiety. To her surprise, she found her son sitting up in the hospital bed, surrounded by scattered coloring pencils on the white sheets, calmly drawing as if it were just another normal day at home. The fluorescent light accentuated the paleness of his face, contrasting with the surreal normalcy of his movements. The scene, which should have brought relief, only heightened her motherly concern. Something was wrong, very wrong, and she could feel it in every fiber of her being, that never-failing maternal instinct sounding every possible alarm in her mind. The doctors conversed in low voices outside the room, their silhouettes cut against the light of the hallway, casting intrigued glances at Tommy through the glass window. Their confused expressions and tense gestures only confirmed what Sarah already knew in her heart. No one could explain how a child who had suffered an accident of such proportions showed no reaction to pain. In the emergency room lounge, the afternoon shift medical team gathered to discuss the day's cases, with the coffee cups already cold forgotten on the coffee table. The case of little Tommy Miller dominated the conversation, provoking heated debates among the professionals who had attended to the boy. Dr. Phillips, a second-year resident physician, repeatedly flipped through the notes he had made during the examination, while his supervisor, Dr. Cameron, listened attentively to the reports of the nurses who had participated in the initial treatment. "I've seen cases of children who take time to manifest pain due to the shock of the accident," commented Dr. Cameron, adjusting her gold-framed glasses as she analyzed the first X-rays that had arrived. "But I confess that the calmness of this boy is something peculiar. He talked to me about his favorite cartoons, while I examined the impact points from the fall, without showing absolutely any discomfort." The other professionals in the room nodded, recalling their own observations during the treatment. One of the most experienced nurses on duty reported that in his 15 years of practice, he had never witnessed a child so completely oblivious to physical pain after an accident of that magnitude. The conversation was momentarily interrupted when a young nurse entered the room bringing the results of Tommy's blood tests. "The inflammatory markers are normal, doctor," she informed, handing over the folder with the documents. "And the boy has just asked for a hot chocolate and wondered if he can watch cartoons on the room's TV." The naturalness with which Tommy dealt with the situation caused a mixture of admiration and concern among the professionals, who continued trying to fit the pieces of this intriguing medical puzzle. Dr. Cameron made some additional notes in the medical record, her pensive expression revealing that something about that case aroused her professional curiosity. Outside the lounge, Sarah Miller walked nervously down the corridor, alternating between calls to her supervisor at Sunshine Diner, explaining her sudden departure from work, and moments of silent prayer, her hands firmly gripping the small cross pendant she carried around her neck. Mrs. Johnson remained by her side, offering words of comfort and assuring her that she would take full responsibility for the accident. The two women watched through the window of the room as Tommy, oblivious to the concern he was causing, played animatedly with a small paper plane that one of the nurses had made with pages from an old magazine to distract him. At the nurses' station, comments about Tommy's case began to circulate among the hospital staff. "Did you see the boy in room 302? They whispered among themselves. "He fell from a huge height and is there, playing as if nothing had happened." The story of the boy who felt no pain began to arouse the team's curiosity, although no one suspected yet that this seemingly simple case could hide something much more complex. Tommy's medical record passed from hand to hand, with different professionals adding their observations and theories about the boy's surprising resilience. Dr. Cameron meticulously organized her notes on the glass table, while Dr. Phillips projected Tommy's test images on the digital screen that occupied one of the walls. The aroma of strong coffee filled the environment, mingling with the palpable tension that always preceded the arrival of Dr. Ethan Blake, known as much for his brilliance as for his unpredictable temperament. The resident doctors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, preparing for another session that promised to be as educational as it was intimidating. The distinctive sound of his footsteps against the marble floor announced Blake's arrival even before he appeared at the door. Wearing a rumpled dark blazer over a light blue shirt, he entered the room with an expression of boredom already established on his face. His perspicacious eyes quickly scanned the images projected on the screen. Without waiting for an invitation, he helped himself to a cup of coffee and occupied his usual chair at the head of the table, his movements demonstrating years of practice in ignoring the basic social formalities that most people would consider essential. "So," Blake began, his voice carrying that tone of sarcasm his team knew so well, "you called me here to see a child who doesn't feel pain. Let me guess. All the basic tests were done, the results are inconclusive, and now you want me to turn this into an exciting episode of medical mystery." Dr. Cameron took a deep breath, already anticipating the battle she would face. "Dr. Blake, the case presents some interesting peculiarities. The patient's neurological response pattern suggests..." But before she could complete her explanation, Blake interrupted her with an impatient wave of his free hand. "Congenital insensitivity to pain," he declared, with the same excitement as someone reading a shopping list. "A rare genetic condition, but perfectly documented. The boy was born with a mutation that affects pain receptors. It's not a mystery, it's basic genetics." He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the taste he considered inferior to what he usually prepared in his office. Dr. Phillips tried to intervene, mentioning some peculiar aspects of the case, but Blake was already scribbling his signature at the bottom of the medical record, authorizing the patient's discharge as soon as he recovered from his injuries. "Give the standard guidance to the family. Make the referral to a geneticist and clear the bed for someone who really needs it." The frustration was visible on Dr. Cameron's face as she watched Blake stand up, clearly considering the matter closed. "But sir, what if there's something we're missing? What if..." Blake spun on his heels, his penetrating gaze fixing on her with an intensity that made the entire room hold its breath. "Dr. Cameron, not every case needs to be an epic diagnostic adventure. Sometimes the horse you hear galloping is just a horse, not a zebra wearing tutus and dancing ballet." His analogy drew some nervous smiles from the younger residents, which quickly turned into serious expressions under his stern gaze. While Blake made his way to the door, he made one final observation over his shoulder. "If you really want an interesting case, I suggest you take a look at the patient in room 412. That one has symptoms that don't make sense." And with that, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind a team divided between relief and frustration. Dr. Cameron began to gather her documents, knowing that, for now, she would have to accept Blake's decision. Tommy Miller's case would be filed as another example of a rare but diagnosable condition without further investigation or complications. No one in the room could have imagined that, in a few days, they would all wish they had paid more attention to the small details that now seemed so insignificant. Days passed, and the discharge process dragged on into the afternoon as Sarah Miller gathered Tommy's belongings, carefully tucking the multiple sheets of medical instructions into her worn bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the hospital pajamas Tommy had worn, a mechanical gesture that masked the storm of worries swirling in her mind. The doctor's explanation of the genetic condition seemed too clear and scientific to soothe a mother's heart, who since her son's birth had learned to trust her instincts. Something deep within her soul screamed that this diagnosis, no matter how elaborate, did not fully explain what was happening to her boy. Tommy, oblivious to his mother's concerns, bounced around the room collecting his drawings from the walls, animatedly commenting on how he could hardly wait to show the other kids in the housing project his new superhero abilities. "Doctor, Cameron had explained that extra care would be needed now, since the lack of pain meant small injuries could go unnoticed and turn into bigger problems. Sarah watched her son with a look that blended love and apprehension, noticing little details in his movements that seemed slightly off from normal. Or was it just her anxious mother's imagination? The way he occasionally favored one leg over the other, a slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the colored pencils, subtle details the doctors had dismissed as irrelevant. The nurse handling the discharge procedures noticed Sarah's hesitation as she signed the final paperwork. "Mrs. Miller, is everything okay?" she gently asked, placing a comforting hand on the distraught mother's shoulder. Sarah tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach her worried eyes. "It's just, I can't explain. I have this feeling we're missing something important," she confessed, her voice low so Tommy wouldn't overhear. "Kids are tougher than we think," the nurse replied with a reassuring smile, repeating the words she'd said hundreds of times to other anxious parents. But Sarah couldn't shake that nagging sense of unease growing in her chest, like a dark premonition that refused to be silenced. The walk to the hospital exit felt endless. Each step echoed down the corridors as Sarah firmly held Tommy's hand, the heavy bag of paperwork and instructions weighing down her other arm. Mrs. Johnson waited for them in the lobby, her face etched with the weariness and worry of the past few days, yet still wearing that warm smile that meant so much to the Miller family. "Sarah, dear, let me help you with those things," the elderly woman offered, sensing the physical and emotional weight the young mother carried. Tommy ran to hug his caretaker, bombarding her with stories about his hospital adventure, while Sarah lingered a few steps behind, her mind obsessively replaying every detail of the past 48 hours. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as the trio finally made their way to the bus stop. Sarah watched Tommy walking ahead of her, her heart clenching at every minor stumble or uneven movement she noticed. Doctor. Blake's overheard words earlier about how some cases were too simple to merit special attention echoed in her mind, mingling with her own doubts and fears. The gentle breeze carried the sound of Tommy's laughter as he pretended to be an invincible superhero, but to Sarah, each giggle felt like a reminder of how vulnerable her son was, even if he couldn't feel pain. As they waited for the bus that would take them back to the Pine Grove housing project, Sarah clutched the cross she wore around her neck, whispering a silent prayer. Her maternal instinct, that inner voice that had never led her astray before, kept warning her that something more serious was on the horizon. It was as if the universe was trying to tell her this wouldn't be the last time they crossed the doors of that hospital. Far from there, the office of Director Victoria Henshaw emanated an aura of power and sophistication, its walls lined with dark wood paneling and strategically placed diplomas. The rhythmic sound of Ethan Blake's footsteps echoed down the hallway before he barged through the door without knocking, completely ignoring the secretary trying to announce his arrival. Director Henshaw looked up from a stack of paperwork, her face taking on that expression of contained displeasure she reserved especially for him. The tension between the two was almost palpable, carrying the weight of countless previous clashes and unresolved disagreements over how Blake ran his department. "Doctor." "Blake, what an agreeable surprise," Henshaw commented, her polite tone masking evident irritation. "I've just received 3 more complaints about you refusing cases you deem uninteresting. The Miller boy is only the latest in a long line." Blake made himself comfortable in the chair across from her desk without being invited, his deliberately casual posture a direct contrast to the formality of the setting. "Victoria," he replied, purposefully using her first name, knowing how much it irked her. "You really want me wasting my precious time on cases any first-year resident could handle? That kid has a well-documented genetic condition. End of story." The conversation exploded into a clash of conflicting personalities and philosophies on the practice of medicine. Henshaw rose from her chair, planting her hands on the mahogany desk as she leaned forward slightly. "This hospital doesn't exist solely to satisfy your need to solve complex medical puzzles, Blake. Every patient deserves the best possible care, not just the ones you find intellectually stimulating." Her words were precise, weighted with years of built-up frustration over the doctor's behavior. Blake responded with that sardonic smile he always wore when he was about to deliver a particularly biting remark. "And that's exactly why we have scores of perfectly mediocre physicians to handle those perfectly mediocre cases. My talent is better utilized on situations that truly require extraordinary experience and brilliance. The discussion was interrupted by the shrill sound of the phone on Henshaw's desk. She answered briefly, her expression hardening further as she hung up. This conversation is not over, Blake. Your department consumes a disproportionate amount of the hospital's resources, and you cannot continue to pick and choose only the cases you deem worthy of your attention. Blake was already standing, making his way toward the door with the same arrogance with which he had entered. Of course it's not over, Victoria. It never ends, he commented over his shoulder, his voice carrying that amused tone that always exasperated her. But as long as you keep needing my success rates to maintain this hospital's prestige, we'll keep having these delightful meetings. Minutes later, Nathan Ellis found Blake in his office, where the older doctor was comfortably settled in his leather armchair, fiddling with a complex mechanical metal puzzle while consulting a medical article on his tablet. The office, with its blinds perpetually drawn and purposefully low lighting, perfectly reflected its occupant's personality, an environment that discouraged unwanted visitors and unnecessary conversation. Nathan, however, was one of the few people who dared cross that invisible boundary Blake established between himself and the rest of the world, bringing with him Tommy Miller's file and that characteristic smile that tended to disarm even the most difficult patients. You know, Blake, Nathan began, settling into the chair across from the desk without waiting for an invitation, that kid who got discharged from room 302 had something different going on. It's not just the insensitivity to pain. There are other signs that don't quite fit the standard diagnosis. Blake paused the motion of the puzzle, casting a bored look at his younger colleague. Ellis, your ability to turn the obvious into mystery is almost endearing. What's the next big discovery? That the flu causes sneezing. Nathan kept his composure, already accustomed to Blake's cutting sarcasm. I'm serious. That mother, there's something in her eyes. She knows her son, knows something's off. Blake let out a dry laugh. What do you want? For me to solve all the world's problems? Why don't we start with world hunger? Or maybe global warming is more your style. Days later, the morning at the Pine Grove housing complex began with a scream that cut through the thin walls of the Miller apartment. Sarah, who had just returned from the night shift at the restaurant, found Tommy sitting on the floor of his room, trying in vain to get up. The faint light streaming in through the window revealed the boy's confused and frightened face, so different from his usual cheerful expression. "Mom, my legs don't want to work right," he mumbled, his voice tinged with fear for the first time. Mrs. Johnson, who had arrived earlier to watch Tommy, observed the scene from the doorway, her wrinkled hands trembling as she dialed emergency services. The past 3 days had been a gradual descent into the nightmare Sarah had so dreaded. First, it was the small stumbles Tommy took while walking, then the increasing difficulty climbing the building's stairs, and now this, the complete inability to remain standing. The panic Sarah had kept in check since the hospital discharge finally spilled over, her silent tears falling as she tried to keep her voice steady so as not to frighten her son further. "It's okay, my love. Mommy's here," she repeated, cradling Tommy in her arms, watching in horror as his little legs moved in uncoordinated jerks. The ambulance ride seemed to last an eternity. Tommy, lying on the stretcher, alternated between moments of lucidity and periods of confusion, repeatedly asking where his favorite toy plane was or why they couldn't go to the park that day. The paramedics exchanged worried glances as they monitored his vitals, asking technical questions Sarah could barely process. Her world had shrunk to the sound of the siren and Tommy's little hands squeezing hers, a grip that seemed weaker with every passing minute. The arrival at the emergency room was a blur of urgent voices and fluorescent lights. Dr. Cameron, who had treated Tommy during his first hospitalization, rushed to meet the stretcher as soon as she recognized the patient. The contrast between the smiling boy she had discharged days before and the confused, debilitated child before her was shocking. "Tommy, can you squeeze my hand?" the doctor asked, her professional tone masking growing concern. The boy tried, but his fingers barely moved. Sarah watched every test, every reaction, her heart clenching when Tommy couldn't identify how many fingers the doctor held up or tell her what day it was. The emergency room transformed into a whirlwind of activity. Nurses rushed in and out, collecting blood samples and hooking up monitors. Tommy, who had always faced medical procedures with curiosity and good humor, now seemed lost in his own world, his glassy eyes fixed on some distant point on the ceiling. "Mom, why is everything spinning?" he asked at one point, his small, frightened voice cutting through Sarah's heart. Mrs. Johnson remained in a corner of the room, her silent prayers mingling with the steady beep of the heart monitors. The deterioration was visible with every passing hour. Preliminary test results began trickling in, each one adding to the concern etched on the medical team's faces. "Doctor." Cameron ordered more tests with growing urgency, quickly consulting her colleagues about the alarming symptoms developing. Tommy now struggled even to keep his eyes focused, his thoughts jumbling amid disconnected phrases about superheroes and chocolate ice cream. Sarah gripped his hand tightly, as if through that contact she could prevent her son from slipping further away from her. In a moment of clarity, Tommy looked at his mother with those big brown eyes that always melted her heart. "Mom, I can't really feel where you're holding," he said, his voice betraying a confusion that went beyond simple absence of pain. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile as she stroked her son's damp hair. "Dr." Cameron, observing the interaction, made a quick note in the file. The loss of sensation was spreading beyond the pain receptors, a development that completely contradicted the initial diagnosis of a simple genetic condition. In the emergency meeting room, Dr. Cameron spread a series of tests across the glass table, her hands trembling slightly as she compared the most recent results with those from 3 days ago. The fluorescent lights accentuated the deep circles under her eyes, the result of uninterrupted hours monitoring Tommy's deteriorating condition. Dr. Phillips rushed in, carrying a new set of lab results that only confirmed their worst fears. The progression of symptoms completely defied the initial diagnosis of a simple genetic mutation, and the fear in the eyes of the two doctors reflected the gravity of the unfolding situation before them. "The muscle enzyme levels are rising exponentially," explained Dr. Phillips, his voice betraying the frustration and concern he felt. "The MRI shows signs of progressive inflammation in the peripheral nervous system, and the nerve conduction tests indicate an accelerated degradation of the nerve fibers. This is not consistent with a stable genetic condition." Dr. Cameron nodded gravely, her eyes fixed on the images that showed in shades of gray and white, Tommy's nervous system being attacked by an invisible and still unknown enemy. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the heart monitors in the hallway. A veteran nurse entered the room, bringing the latest notes on Tommy's vital signs. "His temperature is gradually rising, doctor, and the mental confusion is worsening. He asked 3 times in the last 10 minutes where he was and couldn't recognize Mrs. Johnson when she called him." Each new piece of information was like an additional weight on the shoulders of the medical team, who watched helplessly as a much darker picture formed. "Doctor." Cameron ran her hands over her tired face, her mind obsessively going over every detail of the case, desperately searching for something they might have missed, some clue that could explain why an apparently stable child was rapidly plunging into such a critical state. Dr. Phillips projected a series of charts on the room's screen, showing the evolution of Tommy's vital parameters over the past few hours. The lines moving consistently in the wrong direction told an alarming story of a young body fighting against something the doctors still couldn't identify. "The loss of sensitivity is spreading beyond the pain receptors," he explained, pointing to a diagram of the nervous system. "It's now affecting proprioception, balance, and starting to compromise basic motor functions. This is not just a failure of the pain receptors, it's a systemic attack on the peripheral nervous system." A young resident who had just returned from Tommy's room added another piece to the concerning puzzle. "He's experiencing increasingly frequent episodes of disorientation. 10 minutes ago, he tried to grab something in the air that didn't exist, convinced it was his toy plane." Dr. Cameron closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that information sink in. The progression of symptoms was alarmingly rapid, much more aggressive than any typical manifestation of a genetic condition. The clinical picture was evolving in a way that none of those present had witnessed in their careers. The sound of an urgent message on the hospital's system interrupted the discussion. The latest toxicology tests had arrived, and the results were equally baffling. "No signs of bacterial or viral infection, doctor." Cameron read aloud, her frustration growing with each line. No significant autoimmune markers, no signs of exposure to common toxins. Her voice faltered as she reached the last lines of the report, which only confirmed that they were facing something that was completely outside of known patterns. Doctor, Phillips completed the thought that hung heavily in the air. We have to admit, this is not a benign genetic condition. We're losing this boy and we don't know why. The medical team dispersed with a new urgency in their steps, each member carrying the weight of the knowledge that time was running out for Tommy Miller. As they walked through the hospital corridors, the distant sound of Sarah's muffled sobs echoed, as a painful reminder of how much they had underestimated the severity of the situation. Doctor. Cameron paused for a moment at Tommy's room window, watching the boy who was now struggling to perform even the simplest tasks. Her mind went back to the decision to discharge him days earlier, and the guilt of not having investigated more deeply. The subtle signs that Sarah had tried to point out weighed on her chest like lead. Ethan Blake was in his office, immersed in solving a Rubik's Cube while analyzing his current case files, when the sound of a heated discussion in the hallway caught his attention. Doctor, Cameron's voice stood out among the others, discussing Tommy Miller's latest test results. Blake continued meticulously manipulating the cube, but his ears caught every word that traveled through the walls. The mention of progressive neurological degeneration and unexplained systemic failure made his fingers freeze over the colorful puzzle. His professional interest finally peaked. Through the half-open blinds of his office, he observed the frantic movement of the medical team, carrying new batteries of tests and lab results. His keen eyes noticed the details others might miss. The tremor in Dr. Cameron's hands as she held the MRI images, the pallor on Dr. Phillips's face as he consulted the latest vital signs, the urgency of the nurses running with emergency equipment. Blake placed the cube on the desk and rose slowly, his expression changing from boredom to intense curiosity. The case he had dismissed as mundane was beginning to reveal itself as something much more complex and challenging. Without a word, Blake walked over to the hallway's bulletin board, where a series of Tommy's tests were arranged chronologically. His eyes quickly scanned the results, his agile mind beginning to form connections that no one else had noticed. A small, almost imperceptible smile appeared at the corner of his lips, the kind of smile his team knew well, the sign that a truly intriguing puzzle had captured his interest. Interesting, he murmured, touching his face pensively. Very interesting. With a decisive motion, Blake tore the tests from the board and headed towards Tommy's room, leaving behind a medical team simultaneously relieved and apprehensive, knowing that the case had just taken a new and unpredictable turn. Nathan Ellis observed with a discreet smile, while Blake obsessively examined Tommy's scans, now scattered across the meeting room table. The atmosphere was immersed in that characteristic silence that always accompanied the older doctor's moments of intense concentration. The late afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting elongated shadows over the papers and MRI images. As Blake muttered incomprehensible words to himself, his mind clearly immersed in theories and possibilities. Nathan knew that expression well. It was the look of a hunter who had finally found prey worthy of his pursuit. With his hands in the pockets of his lab coat and casually leaning against the doorframe, Nathan finally broke the silence. "Look, a tough case. Seems like it's getting interesting for you now, huh?" His tone was light and provocative, carrying that familiarity that only years of acquaintance allowed. Blake raised his eyes from the exams for a moment, instinctively touching his hair as he processed the comment. The corners of his mouth curved slightly, not exactly a smile, but an expression Nathan recognized as his particular version of amusement. The moment of silent exchange between the two doctors carried years of shared history, mutual teasing, and veiled respect. "Don't confuse scientific interest with charity, Ellis," Blake responded, turning his attention back to the images in front of him, but the slight tone of humor in his voice betrayed his attempt to maintain a facade of indifference. Nathan approached the table, his eyes scanning the exams with genuine curiosity. Of course, a purely scientific interest, nothing to do with the fact that you might have jumped the gun the first time, right?" Blake ignored the provocation, but the way his fingers drummed on the table betrayed that the comment had hit its mark. The silence that followed was filled only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of heart monitors. as the two doctors shared that moment of mutual understanding about the complexity of the case they had ahead of them. Hours later, the diagnostics department had turned into a medical battlefield in the last 12 hours. Blake commanded his team with military precision, ordering an extensive battery of neurological tests that transformed Tommy's medical record into an encyclopedia of medical terms and laboratory results. The whiteboard in his office was covered with hypotheses and symptoms written in his precise angular handwriting, each new theory being methodically tested and so far discarded. The team alternated between the lab and Tommy's room, racing against time as they observed the boy's gradual deterioration. Sarah remained by her son's side, her red-eyed gaze following each new procedure with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Tommy had undergone a series of specialized exams, contrast MRI, spinal tap, nerve conduction tests, each one promising answers that stubbornly refused to appear. The once lively and communicative boy now spent most of his time in a state of silent confusion, his eyes lost, focusing on invisible points on the ceiling. The monitors around him marked the rhythm of a battle that modern medicine seemed to be losing. Blake initiated an empirical treatment with a combination of neuroprotective and potent anti-inflammatory medications, his mind calculating dosages and possible interactions as he observed Tommy's reactions through the ICU glass. Dr. Cameron and Dr. Phillips alternated in extended shifts, monitoring every small change in the patient's vital signs, every fluctuation in electrolyte levels, every new symptom that could provide the clue they so desperately sought. The nurses kept meticulous records of all changes, no matter how minor, knowing that Blake would demand precise information during his rounds. The first 24 hours of treatment brought a roller coaster of emotions. For a brief moment, Tommy seemed to respond positively to the medications. His eyes focused more clearly, and he even managed to recognize Mrs. Johnson during a short visit. Hope, however, was as brief as it was cruel. Within a matter of hours, new symptoms began to manifest, as if the boy's body was determined to defy every attempt at treatment. Blake ordered changes in medication, adjusting doses and combinations with the intensity of someone waging a personal battle against the disease. The team's frustration was palpable during the case update meetings. Blake remained in his office late into the night, studying medical articles and consulting specialists in different countries, searching for similar cases that could provide some direction. The glass walls of his office reflected the image of a doctor, consumed by the determination to solve a puzzle that became more complex with every hour. Piles of medical literature accumulated on his desk, each page marked and annotated in his relentless search for answers. Tommy continued his inexorable descent. The medications that should have been protecting his nervous system seemed to have no effect at all, as if they were fighting the wrong enemy. Sarah watched helplessly as her son gradually lost more motor functions. The boy who loved to draw superheroes could now barely hold a pencil, his fingers refusing to obey his brain's basic commands. His mother's whispered prayers mingled with the constant beeping of the monitors, creating a painful symphony of hope and despair. The morning in the ICU room began with a scream that chilled the blood of everyone present. "Mum, it's getting dark." Tommy's voice sounded scared, his small hands groping the air for something to hold on to. Sarah, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, woke with a start. The fluorescent lights of the room shone with the same intensity as always, but for Tommy, the world was beginning to disappear into a dark and frightening haze. His eyes, once so lively and expressive, now moved erratically, desperately trying to capture any fragment of light or shape he could still distinguish. The medical team burst into the room in a matter of seconds, responding to the monitor alarms registering Tommy's sudden spike in heart rate. Dr. Cameron was the first to arrive, closely followed by two residents who immediately began setting up equipment for an emergency ophthalmological examination. Tommy's panic was palpable, his words mixed with sobs as he tried to explain what was happening. "The colors are different, everything's blurry. Mom, I can't see your face properly." His small hands reached out, seeking the familiar contact that could anchor him in that moment of terror. Blake burst into the room minutes later, his normally impassive face betraying signs of genuine concern. As he examined Tommy's pupils with a small flashlight, His mind was already processing this new and alarming development in the case. The pupils responded to light but irregularly, and Tommy reported seeing only distorted shadows where there should have been clear images. The progressive loss of vision represented a new and frightening development, a symptom that didn't fit any of the theories they had considered so far. Pediatric neurologists were called in for an emergency consultation, turning the small ICU room into an improvised medical conference hall. Sarah watched the procedures with silent horror, her breath caught in her throat as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile line between hope and despair. Her prayers, once steady and resolute, had become broken whispers, interspersed with muffled sobs as she clung desperately to her son's hand, her fingers trembling against his clammy skin. The beeping of the monitors echoed in her ears, a relentless metronome counting down the unknown, each sharp tone amplifying the sheer helplessness coursing through her veins. Tommy, who had always faced his medical issues with a resilience far beyond his years, was now visibly trembling, his wide, fearful eyes darting from one masked figure to another. His small fingers clutched at Sarah's with desperate urgency, as if anchoring himself to the one certainty he had left. His voice, usually steady even in the most painful moments, now wavered with a raw fragility. "Mom, don't leave me alone, please," he pleaded, the words barely more than a breath against the sterile air around them. The creeping darkness invading his vision seemed to rob him not only of color and shape, but of the unwavering bravery that had always defined him. His world, once filled with bright hues and the warmth of his mother's embrace, was shrinking into a tunnel of shadows, each flickering light above him appearing distant and unreachable. The weight of exhaustion pressed heavily upon him, his body betraying him in ways he couldn't understand, and fear settled deep in his bones, colder than the antiseptic air that filled the room. At the threshold, Mrs. Johnson, who had just arrived for her daily visit, stood frozen in place, her entire body stiff with the kind of shock that turned bones to ice. Her hands shot up to cover her mouth, muffling the soft gasp that escaped as she took in the harrowing sight before her. The once familiar hospital room had transformed into a battlefield, with Tommy's frail form at the center, surrounded by figures in scrubs moving with the practiced urgency of those fighting against time. The dull overhead lights cast harsh shadows over the boy's face, emphasizing the pallor of his skin, the faint sheen of sweat that glistened against his forehead. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she took a hesitant step forward, torn between the instinct to rush to Sarah's side and the fear of intruding on a moment so raw, so heartbreakingly delicate. The weight of unspoken prayers filled the air, mingling with the distant hum of medical equipment, as three lives stood suspended in that suffocating moment between agony and hope. Preliminary examinations of Tommy's vision revealed a bewildering picture. There were no signs of structural damage to the eyes, no immediate physical explanation for the progressive loss of vision. It was as if the nervous system was simply failing to process visual information, a new failure in a cascade of neurological breakdowns that no one could explain or stop. Blake ordered a new battery of imaging tests, his frustration evident in the way he ran his hands through his hair as he studied the incoming results. Each new test only confirmed what they already feared. They were losing the battle against an enemy they couldn't identify. The medical team worked frenetically, adjusting medications and trying new therapeutic approaches, but the sense of helplessness grew with every passing hour. Tommy now lived in an increasingly dark world, where the colors and shapes he so loved in his superhero drawings gradually faded away, replaced by frightening and undefined shadows. His only connection to the outside world was his mother's constant touch and the familiar voices that tried in vain to reassure him. The fear in his voice when he asked if he would be blind forever was a stab in the heart of everyone present, especially because no one had an answer to give him. In the silence of his office, lit only by the bluish glow of the computer, Blake stared at the whiteboard covered in medical hypotheses as if facing a personal enemy. His theories, usually so precise and well-founded, now seemed to dance before his eyes like puzzle pieces refusing to form a coherent picture. The distant sound of the ICU monitors reached through the walls, constantly reminding him that while he struggled with theories and possibilities, a 7-year-old boy was gradually losing his connection to the world. The computer screen displayed dozens of open medical articles, each promising answers that proved inadequate, when confronted with the reality of Tommy's case. Blake abruptly rose from his chair, approaching the board to erase yet another hypothesis that had just proven incorrect. The sharp movement knocked over a pile of test results on the desk, scattering evidence of his failure to find an explanation for what was happening on the floor. His hands, usually so steady and precise, trembled slightly as he gathered the papers, frustration evident in every movement. "None of this makes sense," he muttered to himself, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and perplexity he rarely allowed others to perceive. Tommy's symptoms defied medical logic. The progression was too rapid for a common degenerative disease, but too irregular for a typical infection. The loss of vision was the final blow to his earlier theories, a development that didn't fit any of the patterns he knew so well. For the first time in a long while, Blake felt the weight of doubt gnawing at his usual confidence. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty office as he paced back and forth, his mind racing through increasingly unlikely possibilities, desperately searching for an explanation that continued to slip through his fingers like sand. Victoria Henshaw burst into the diagnostic imaging lab, holding a stack of authorization forms in her hands, her high heels marking an irritated rhythm against the floor. Blake's latest requisition for a series of specialized tests had been the last straw. The total value of the procedures requested for the Miller case alone had already exceeded her department's monthly budget. The lab technicians discreetly found reasons to leave the room, recognizing the signs of yet another impending battle between the director and the doctor, who constantly challenged the hospital's financial limits. 3 MRIs with contrast in less than 48 hours, Blake? Do you have any idea of the cost of those scans, not to mention the specialized genetic tests you ordered from Germany? Henshaw's voice echoed through the room as she waved the forms as evidence of her indignation. Blake continued analyzing the images on his monitor, seemingly distracted by the contrast patterns forming on the screen. His silence only fueled the director's frustration as she now leaned against the counter beside him. "This hospital is not your personal research laboratory. We have budgets, protocols, limitations." Blake finally turned, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her hesitate for a moment. "Would you rather I save on treatment or explain to the press why we let a 7-year-old child lose their sight over budgetary issues?" The silence that followed was her final answer, as he turned his attention back to the images, clearly ending the discussion. Minutes later, after the exchange with Victoria, Nathan Ellis found Blake in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone in a secluded corner with an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The echo of the recent dispute with Director Henshaw still hung in the air, and the tension was visible in Blake's rigid shoulders as he studied yet another set of test results. The strong aroma of coffee mingled with the sterilized hospital environment, creating that unique atmosphere that only healthcare professionals knew so well during long shifts. Nathan approached with his own coffee, taking a seat uninvited in the chair across from Blake. "You know," Nathan began with that characteristic smile that always preceded his moments of sagacity, "have you tried pretending to care about Director Henshaw, just to see what happens? Maybe she'll have a heart attack from the surprise and release next year's entire budget." The comment drew a half-amused, half-exasperated look from Blake, who finally put down the papers he was analyzing. Nathan continued, seizing the opening. "Just imagine. A smile here, a good morning there. We could even film her reactions for medical posterity." Blake tried to maintain a serious expression, but a slight tremor at the corner of his mouth betrayed his amusement. "Ellis, your ability to turn an administrative crisis into comedy is almost as impressive as your inability to let me work in peace," he replied. But there was a touch of gratitude in his voice for the welcome distraction. It was nearly midnight when Blake suddenly rose from his chair, his expression shifting from frustration to renewed intensity. He had spent the last few hours obsessively reviewing every detail of Tommy's case, every symptom, every test result, when something in his mind finally connected. "We're looking in the wrong place," he muttered to himself as he scribbled some quick notes. Dr. Cameron and Dr. Phillips, who had also remained at the hospital late, observed the sudden change in their superior's demeanor with a mixture of curiosity and hope. "It's not the boy's body we need to investigate," Blake announced, his voice carrying that characteristic certainty that always emerged when he began piecing together a medical puzzle. "It's his environment. Something is causing this progressive neurological degeneration, and I'll bet we'll find the answer in the place where he lives." He began listing a series of possible environmental causes that could explain the symptoms: toxins, contaminants, exposure to unknown chemicals. The team watched as he filled the whiteboard with a new direction of investigation, his energy infecting everyone present with a renewed sense of purpose. The mobilization was immediate. Blake divided his team into groups, assigning specific areas of investigation at the Pine Grove housing complex. Dr. Cameron was tasked with collecting water and soil samples, while Dr. Phillips was to investigate potential sources of contamination in the indoor environment of the apartment. The residents were instructed to interview other tenants of the complex, especially families with children, looking for patterns of similar symptoms that may have gone unnoticed. The operation was planned with military precision, every aspect carefully considered. Upon arrival, Sarah provided the keys to her apartment with trembling hands, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension as she described Tommy's daily routine. "He used to play a lot at the playground," she explained, her voice thick with emotion, "and he'd spend afternoons at Mrs. Johnson's place on the 3rd floor. Blake absorbed every detail, his mind already mapping potential routes of exposure to toxic agents. The housing complex, with its peeling walls and crumbling infrastructure, began to look less like a home and more like a medical crime scene that needed to be unraveled. The team geared up with collection and analysis equipment. Maps of the housing complex were laid out, with markings indicating priority areas of investigation. Blake coordinated everything with focused intensity, instructing his team on collection and documentation procedures. "Don't assume anything," he warned. "Photograph everything, collect samples of anything that seems suspicious. What we're looking for could be hidden in the most insignificant details." During the investigation, the Miller apartment revealed a story of struggle against poverty in every corner. Dr. Cameron walked through the small rooms with a watchful eye, noting the peeling wallpaper that Sarah tried to hold together with tape, the water stains on the ceiling forming yellowed maps of structural neglect, and the mold spreading in the corners of ill-fitting windows. Every surface was tested, every suspicious stain was photographed and catalogated, as the team meticulously collected samples, searching for any clue that could explain Tommy's condition. The boys' room was a study in contrasts. Walls covered in colorful drawings of superheroes tried to mask the cracks that spread like spider webs across the old plaster. The small bed was neatly made, the Avengers comforter lovingly smoothed, while next to it a lopsided dresser housed the child's few items of clothing. Dr. Phillips collected air and surface samples, his expression growing more somber as the portable analysis equipment showed only expected levels of common pollutants in old buildings, nothing that could explain the devastating neurological condition consuming Tommy. The kitchen told its own story of dignified deprivation. The cabinets, though clean and organized, revealed empty shelves and a few carefully rationed cans of basic food items. Dr. Cameron examined every container, collected samples from the tap water, and checked the interior of the old loudly humming refrigerator in the corner. Preliminary analyses showed typical contaminants from aging pipes, but nothing extraordinary, nothing to justify the progressive collapse of a 7-year-old's nervous system. The team's frustration grew with each negative test, each sample revealing only common poverty, not the cause they so desperately sought. The playground where Tommy used to play was a monument to urban neglect. Rusted equipment creaked in the light breeze, rust stains bled onto the cracked concrete, and the sandbox was mixed with shards of glass and litter. The team collected soil samples, tested the metal surfaces of the equipment, and examined every corner of the communal space. Other residents watched curiously from their windows as the doctors, looking like scientists in a disaster zone, documented every aspect of the degraded environment. But again, the results showed only the usual hazards of an abandoned playground, nothing that explained the mysterious illness. In Mrs. Johnson's apartment on the 3rd floor, the story repeated itself. The environment, although more organized and welcoming than the building's common areas, presented the same structural issues. The elderly woman watched anxiously as the team examined every corner of her living room, where Tommy spent his afternoons. "He loved sitting here by the window to draw," she explained, her voice trembling as she pointed to a small table covered with colored pencils and papers. Air surface and even drawing material analyses revealed only the common traces of a modest life in an old building. Once again, no clues as to what was destroying little Tommy's life. The team gathered in the housing complex's parking lot at the end of the day, carrying dozens of labeled samples and pages of notes documenting systemic poverty, but no clear answers. Tired faces reflected not just the physical exhaustion of the meticulous investigation, but also the emotional weight of witnessing the conditions so many families were forced to endure. Dr. Phillips reviewed the preliminary results on his tablet, each negative data point increasing his frustration. "We found it all: mold, asbestos, low levels of lead, ventilation issues, but nothing that explains Tommy's specific symptoms," he summarized, his voice carrying the weight of the mission's apparent failure. Hours passed, and Director Victoria Henshaw awaited Blake's team in the hospital lobby, her heels tapping an impatient rhythm on the polished floor as she watched the doctors returning from their investigation at the housing complex. Her face was tense with a mixture of irritation and professional indignation at seeing the team carrying dozens of collected samples and equipment that certainly didn't fit into the hospital's regular budget. The usual hospital hum seemed to quiet as she finally approached the group, her presence commanding immediate attention from the passing staff members. "Dr. Blake, we need to talk. Now." Her voice cut through the air like an icy blade as she gestured toward her office. Inside, she closed the door with more force than necessary, the sound echoing like a harbinger of the storm to come. "You've turned my hospital into some kind of environmental agency. Sent a whole team to investigate housing conditions. That's the city's job, social services, not a hospital's." Her voice gradually rose, weeks of frustration finally spilling over. Blake remained standing, his expression unwavering as he met the director's gaze with eyes that had faced far worse opposition. "This hospital has neither the resources nor the authority to investigate housing issues," Henshaw continued, now in a more controlled but no less intense tone. "Our job is to treat patients, not solve social problems. I want you to cease this investigation immediately and focus exclusively on the boy's medical treatment." She slid a memo across the desk toward Blake, a direct order to halt all investigative activities outside the hospital. Blake looked at the paper for a long moment, then directly into Henshaw's eyes. The silence that followed was heavy with the impending conflict between administrative authority and medical determination, as Tommy's life hung precariously in the balance of this power struggle. Blake took the memo from the desk and, for the first time since he'd started working at the hospital, his voice rose above its usual controlled pitch. "So that's how it works? While a 7-year-old boy is losing his sight and mobility, we're supposed to be concerned with jurisdictions and administrative protocols?" The paper crumpled in his gesturing hands as his frustration finally boiled over. Director Henshaw, caught off guard by the unusual outburst, instinctively recoiled in her chair, but maintained her authoritative posture. "There's something killing that boy, Victoria. Something in his environment, something that could be affecting other children in that housing complex. And you want me to just ignore it because it doesn't fit your cost spreadsheets?" Blake's words echoed off the office walls, drawing curious glances from staff passing by in the hallway. Henshaw stood up, meeting Blake's intensity with equal force. "Don't twist my words. This hospital has responsibilities, legal and financial limits that need to be respected. We can't turn into an environmental investigation agency just because you've decided it's necessary." The confrontation reached its peak as Blake slammed his hands on the desk, making Henshaw's coffee cup perilously close to the edge. "What kind of doctors are we if we ignore the cause just because it's outside our walls? What kind of hospital is this if we decide which lives are worth saving based on cost spreadsheets?" His voice carried a mixture of anger and contempt that surprised even those who had known him for years. "You can keep your memo and your rules, Victoria. I'm going to keep looking for answers, with or without this hospital's approval." With those words, he turned and left the office, leaving a stunned Henshaw and a deafening silence behind. Minutes ticked by, and Nathan found Blake on the hospital's rooftop, one of the few places doctors could find a moment's respite from the chaos of the corridors below. The sky was beginning to darken, painting the horizon in shades of purple and orange as the city below started lighting up its first evening glow. The outburst with Henshaw had visibly left Blake tense, his shoulders rigid as he watched the urban landscape transform with the onset of night. The crisp evening air carried the distant sounds of the city, creating an almost meditative atmosphere that Nathan hesitated to break. "You know," Nathan began, approaching with his characteristic casual manner, "have you ever considered therapy? Or would it be a psychological crime to try to help you?" A smile played on his lips as he leaned against the railing next to Blake. The comment drew an exasperated sigh from Blake, but Nathan could perceive the slight relaxation in his posture. "Just imagine the poor therapist trying to deal with your case. They'd probably need therapy afterwards." Blake finally turned to face his colleague, a flicker of amusement crossing his still tense face. "Ellis, you have a special gift for showing up at the worst possible moments with the most ill-timed jokes imaginable," Blake replied, but the corner of his mouth curved slightly, betraying his fondness for his colleague. Shortly after, the shrill sound of the cardiac monitors shattered the quiet of the pediatric ICU in the middle of the night. Tommy had entered a downward spiral that none of the doctors could control. His kidneys were starting to fail, his blood pressure dangerously fluctuating, and his breathing becoming increasingly shallow and irregular. The medical team moved in a frantic dance around the bed, administering medications, adjusting equipment, and desperately trying to stabilize the vital signs that seemed to crumble before their eyes like a house of cards. Sarah, who hadn't left her son's side for days, watched the scene with silent terror. Her ongoing prayers mingled with the sound of the machines and the doctor's urgent voices. Tommy, now connected to even more tubes and monitors, seemed to diminish with each passing hour, his skin taking on an ashen hue that made his mother's heart ache. The boy who once overflowed with energy and imagination now struggled to perform even the most basic functions of his body. Mrs. Johnson, sitting in a corner of the room, clutched her crucifix so tightly that her fingers had turned white, her prayers joining Sarah's in a silent duet of supplication and hope. Blake remained by the bedside, his eyes fixed on the monitors as his mind processed each new datum with an almost palpable intensity. Dr. Cameron and Dr. Phillips alternated in consecutive shifts, no one wanting to leave the hospital, while Tommy remained in such critical condition. Nurses flowed in and out of the room in a constant stream, each carrying more equipment, more medications, more desperate attempts to reverse what seemed irreversible. The rhythmic sound of the ventilator marked the passage of time like an unrelenting metronome, reminding everyone that every minute was precious. The results of the most recent tests painted an even darker picture. Tommy's liver was beginning to show signs of failure, his lab values spiking in all the wrong directions. His body temperature fluctuated between extremes, defying all attempts at regulation. The central nervous system, already severely compromised, showed signs of accelerated deterioration. The medical team had exhausted virtually all available treatment options, each new attempt seeming more an exercise in futility than a real possibility of a cure. In the conference room adjacent to the ICU, Blake was leading a tense discussion with specialists from various departments. Neurologists, nephrologists, hepatologists, all the hospital's top doctors had been summoned to try to find a solution. Theories flew around the room like disoriented birds, each seeming more unlikely than the last. Frustration was palpable in the air, mingling with the aroma of cold coffee and the accumulated fatigue of sleepless nights. Modern medicine, with all its technology and knowledge, seemed impotent in the face of what was happening to Tommy. Sarah watched through the glass as the doctors debated, her heart torn between the need to maintain hope and the growing fear that she was losing her son to something no one could understand. Tommy had stopped speaking hours ago, his last request being for his collection of superhero drawings that still decorated the walls of his room at home. The monitors continued their monotonous wail of alarm, each beep reminding everyone present that time was rapidly running out and that medicine, with all its power and promise, sometimes encountered mysteries it could not unravel. The ICU room plunged into a heavy silence when the doctors finally exited, leaving Sarah alone with Tommy and Mrs. Johnson. The monitors continued their incessant electronic chant, marking each feeble beat of her son's heart. Sarah watched Tommy's pale face, now almost unrecognizable beneath the oxygen mask and the tubes that kept him alive. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the Avenger's blanket over her boy's frail body, a maternal gesture that seemed terribly inadequate in the face of the situation's gravity. The sound of her own ragged breathing echoed in her ears, mingling with the constant hum of the medical equipment. It was when Tommy had a slight seizure that something inside Sarah finally broke. The small spasm of her child, so vulnerable in that bed too large for his diminutive body, was the drop that overflowed the cup of her emotional resilience. Her legs gave way, and she fell to her knees beside the bed, her hands gripping the metal rails so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Mrs. Johnson moved to support her, but Sarah barely registered the comforting touch on her shoulder. Tears she had held back for days began to flow freely as deep sobs racked her entire body. "Lord," her voice began as a tremulous whisper, gradually growing in intensity as the words poured forth from her broken heart. "Please don't take my boy. He's all I have, all I've ever had." Her words mingled with sobs as years of Protestant faith emerged in a desperate plea. Mrs. Johnson, moved by the scene, joined her own prayers to Sarah's, their voices intertwining in a harmony of maternal supplication. The small crucifix Sarah always wore around her neck was now clutched tightly in her hands, the delicate chain leaving indentations in her palm from the strength of her grip. "Tommy is just a child, Lord. He has so many dreams, so many drawings yet to make. His superheroes still need him." Sarah raised her eyes to the ceiling, as if she could see straight through to the heavens above. Her words now flowed like a river, carrying all the anguish and love of a mother watching helplessly as her child fought for life. "If you need to take someone, take me instead of him. I would give my life 1,000 times to see my son running and playing again." The intensity of her plea filled the room, transforming the sterile medical space into something almost sacred. Mrs. Johnson knelt beside Sarah, her own silent tears marking trails on her wrinkled face. The two women formed an image of faith and despair that would have broken the heart of any observer. Outside the room, the passing nurses instinctively slowed their pace, touched by the scene they witnessed through the glass. The sound of prayers penetrated the thin walls, reaching the corridors where the medical staff continued their tireless work, reminding everyone that beyond science and medicine, there was a dimension of hope and faith that could not be measured by monitors or expressed in test results. Sarah continued her prayer vigil, her exhausted body sustained only by the strength of her faith and maternal love. The hours dragged on as she alternated between fervent pleas and heavy moments of silence, where only the sound of medical equipment reminded her that time kept passing. Occasionally, she would caress Tommy's face or adjust his hair, each gentle touch accompanied by a new wave of whispered prayers. The ICU room, with its white walls and intimidating equipment, had become an improvised sanctuary where a mother waged her own spiritual battle for her son's life. Outside Tommy's room, Blake watched through the glass the unfolding scene of devotion between mother and son. The muffled sound of Sarah's prayers penetrated the walls, mingling with the monotonous beeping of the heart monitors that marked the boy's increasingly difficult battle for survival. The doctor remained motionless, his reflection in the glass revealing an expression few had witnessed on his face, the shadow of doubt. His years of experience and knowledge seemed insignificant in the face of the mystery consuming Tommy's life, an enigma that for the first time made him question his own ability to save a patient. The latest test results were scattered in his hands, each page telling the story of a young body in systematic collapse. Blake had faced difficult cases before, situations that seemed impossible, and yet he had managed to solve them through his brilliant deductive ability. But this time was different. Every theory they developed was quickly invalidated by the relentless progression of Tommy's illness. Time was running out, and for the first time in his career, Blake felt the crushing weight of the possibility of failure. The sound of Sarah's prayers echoed in his ears as a constant reminder that beyond medical equations and scientific diagnoses, there was a profoundly human dimension at stake, the life of a 7-year-old boy who trusted him to find answers. The papers in his hands trembled slightly as his mind obsessively retraced every detail of the case, desperately searching for any clue he might have missed, any pattern he might have ignored. The reflection in the glass showed no longer the confident, sarcastic doctor everyone knew, but a man confronting his own limits, questioning whether this time the challenge he faced would be greater than his ability to solve it. The distant sound of Sarah's prayers continued, a plea that now seemed more powerful than all the medical knowledge he possessed. Nathan found Blake still standing before the glass of Tommy's room, his gaze fixed on the scene of devotion unfolding on the other side. The ICU corridor was quiet at that hour of the night, except for the distant murmur of Sarah's prayers and the constant sound of medical equipment. The fluorescent light of the hallway cast long shadows over their figures, creating an almost surreal atmosphere in that moment of shared vulnerability. Nathan, usually ready with a joke or witty remark, wore a serious expression he rarely displayed. "You're staring at that scene like you're trying to diagnose faith itself," Nathan commented softly, positioning himself beside Blake. His voice, stripped of its usual playful tone, carried a depth that would surprise those who knew him only superficially. Blake remained silent, his eyes still fixed on the mother kneeling beside her son's bed. "Maybe you don't believe," Nathan continued, "but she needs to believe in something. Let her have that." The words hung in the air between them, laden with a truth that transcended their usual medical and scientific discussions. The silence that followed was different from the other pauses that normally filled their conversations. There was no tension or expectation of a sarcastic response, only a mutual understanding of the complexity of the moment they were witnessing. The sound of prayers continued to penetrate the glass, reminding them that beyond all medical protocols and scientific theories, there existed a dimension of human suffering that no medical book could fully explain. Blake finally averted his gaze from the glass, meeting his colleague's eyes with an expression that revealed more than words could express. In that moment, they were not just two doctors discussing a case. They were two human beings recognizing the limits of their own understanding in the face of the mystery of faith and maternal despair. Blake was in his office reviewing for the 1,000th time the photos of the Pine Grove housing complex when his eyes fixed on a detail that had previously gone unnoticed. In one of the playground images, partially buried in the sand, a piece of metal gleamed under the camera's flash. His mind began to work rapidly, connecting dots that had previously seemed disconnected. The playground was near an area that decades ago had been an industrial depot. The children played there daily, breathing in the dust, having direct contact with contaminated soil. In a sudden impulse, Blake began to spread across his desk all the notes on Tommy's symptoms. The progressive loss of sensitivity, the motor coordination problems, the deteriorating vision, the mental confusion. His hands trembled slightly as he frantically typed on his computer, seeking confirmation for the theory that was forming in his mind. Each new scientific article he read made his heart beat faster. The symptoms fit perfectly with a case of mercury poisoning. The heavy metal, likely accumulated in the soil after years of improper industrial disposal, was slowly poisoning Tommy. The Dr. Cameron, who was passing through the hallway, was startled by the sound of Blake knocking over his chair as he abruptly stood up. "The heavy metal tests," he exclaimed, his voice carrying an urgency she rarely witnessed. "Why didn't we do them before? We were so focused on neurological diseases that we ignored the more obvious possibility." His words poured out as he mentally went through all the documented cases of mercury poisoning. The classic symptoms: loss of sensation, coordination issues, progressive neurological deterioration, were exactly what they were seeing in Tommy. The hospital laboratory turned into a whirlwind of activity when Blake burst through the door, ordering a full battery of heavy metal tests on the samples collected from the housing complex. The soil samples from the playground, which had previously been deemed irrelevant, were now the key to solving the mystery. The technicians worked quickly, processing the analyses with renewed urgency as Blake waited, his mind already calculating the treatment protocol they would need to initiate once they had confirmation. The revelation hit Blake like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just Tommy who was at risk. All the children playing in that playground were potentially exposed to mercury. His brain rapidly began cataloging other recent cases of unexplained neurological symptoms that could be related. While awaiting the test results, he was already drafting a detailed report that would be sent to public health authorities. The situation was bigger than a single patient. It was a public health crisis that needed to be contained immediately. The first results began to arrive, confirming his darkest suspicions. Mercury levels in the soil samples were alarmingly high, far exceeding safe limits. Blake immediately ordered blood samples to be taken from Tommy to confirm the presence of the metal in his body. The time they had lost searching for other causes now needed to be made up with swift, decisive action. Treatment with chelating agents, Substances capable of binding to mercury and aiding its elimination from the body would need to be started as soon as possible. Every minute was precious in the battle against the poisoning that had silently infiltrated the boy's body through his innocent playtime on the contaminated playground. The hospital's medical board meeting room was packed that morning, the air heavy with tension and anticipation. Blake was presenting his findings with an urgency that contrasted with the skepticism etched on the administrators' faces. The soil test results and Tommy's preliminary blood analyses were projected on the screen, numbers and graphs telling a chilling story of mercury contamination. Director Henshaw occupied her usual seat at the head of the table. Her expression hardened as she flipped through Blake's report on the proposed treatment costs. "The chelation protocol you're suggesting is experimental for cases like this," declared the head of the finance department, adjusting his glasses as he consulted a detailed spreadsheet. "The cost of treatment is astronomical, and there's no guarantee the patient's insurance will cover an unstandardized procedure." Other administrators nodded in agreement, murmuring about fiscal responsibility and dangerous precedents. Blake remained standing, his hands pressed against the mahogany table as he struggled to maintain his composure in the face of the bureaucracy threatening his patient's life. Victoria Henshaw raised her hand, silencing the room's murmurs. "Dr. Blake, I understand your concern, but this treatment represents a significant risk for the hospital. It's not just a matter of costs. We're talking about potential lawsuits if something goes wrong, not to mention the negative exposure we could face by admitting there is mercury contamination in a residential area." Her voice was calculatedly professional, but carried a tone of finality that made Blake's blood boil. Institutional politics and fear of bad publicity were overriding the urgent need to save a child's life. Dr. Cameron, seated near the door, interjected with statistical data on similar cases of heavy metal poisoning, but her words seemed to ricochet off an invisible wall of administrative resistance. Dr. Phillips presented case studies supporting the proposed treatment's efficacy, but each medical argument was quickly countered by legal and financial concerns. The frustration in the room was palpable, especially among the doctors who understood the gravity of Tommy's situation and the urgency of treatment. Blake watched the discussion unfold like a slow-motion nightmare. Every minute lost in debate meant more time for the mercury to wreak irreversible damage on Tommy's nervous system. Images of the boy hooked up to tubes and monitors, fighting for his life, danced through his mind as the administrators continued their discussion of costs and protocols. The bitter irony of finally discovering the cause of the illness, only to be prevented from treating it by bureaucratic issues, threatened to consume him. "We can't simply ignore established protocols," Henshaw continued, her voice cutting through Blake's thoughts. "We need more tests, more documentation, approvals from ethics committees." Blake finally erupted, interrupting her with an intensity that made everyone in the room start. "While you debate protocols and spreadsheets, a 7-year-old boy is losing his life. Every hour we waste in discussions means permanent neurological damage that could be prevented." His voice echoed through the room, carrying the weight of days of frustration and worry. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant clinking of medical equipment in the hallways. The administrators exchanged uncomfortable glances, while Henshaw held Blake's gaze, her expression a mask of unyielding authority. "I'm sorry, Dr. Blake, but without further evidence and proper approvals, I cannot authorize this treatment. This is my final decision." Her words fell like a hammer on Blake's hopes as he watched Tommy's only chance slip through his fingers due to institutional policies and corporate fears. Hours later, in the quiet of the hospital lab long after most staff had gone home, Blake methodically prepared the chelation protocol. His movements were precise and deliberate as he separated the necessary medications, each vial and ampule carefully checked and documented. The dim nighttime light filtered through the windows, casting elongated shadows dancing across the walls as he organized what he would need to begin the prohibited treatment. The risk he was about to take weighed on his shoulders, but the image of Tommy deteriorating with every passing hour left him no other choice. The Dr. Cameron entered the laboratory silently, closing the door behind her. Her eyes scanned Blake's preparations, a mixture of concern and determination on her face. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice little more than a whisper. If something goes wrong, Blake didn't let her finish, continuing to prepare the medications with the same methodical precision. If we do nothing, he dies. This is not a matter of if, but of when. His words carried a certainty that left no room for debate. Dr. Cameron nodded slowly, moving to help him with the preparations. The plan was traced in his mind with the clarity of a surgical diagram. They would initiate the treatment during the shift change, when supervision was more relaxed. The head nurse on the night shift, who had followed Tommy's deterioration from the start, had already discreetly agreed to participate. Blake knew he was risking his career, his reputation, and possibly even his medical license. But as he labeled the prepared solutions, his mind was focused solely on the clinical data and the protocol he would need to follow. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made both doctors freeze momentarily, but the footsteps moved on, leaving them with adrenaline coursing through their veins and the certainty that there was no turning back. Victoria Henshaw intercepted Blake in the hallway leading to the laboratory, her high heels echoing like a warning against the linoleum floor. The night hospital seemed to hold its breath as she approached, her posture emanating a chilling authority that made even the most experienced nurses step aside. Her eyes, normally calculating and controlled, now shone with a mixture of anger and determination. The encounter was no coincidence. Someone had informed about the suspicious activity in the laboratory during the night. "Don't think I don't know exactly what you're planning, Blake." Her voice cut through the air like a blade of ice. "You may consider yourself above the rules of this hospital, but I'm still the director here. And I'm telling you, with all possible clarity, if you go through with this unauthorized treatment and something goes wrong, your career at this hospital, no, your career in medicine, will be over." The threat hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud, each word laden with the weight of years of accumulated conflicts and institutional power. The fluorescent hallway lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, accentuating the tension of the moment. Blake met Henshaw's gaze with an intensity that would make most people back down. But she held her ground, years of administrative battles having forged her determination into steel. "Let me make this even clearer," she continued, her voice dropping to a controlled whisper that carried even more threat than her earlier tones. "If you disobey my direct orders, there will be no more interesting cases, no more medical autonomy, no more second chances. I'm talking about immediate suspension and a full disciplinary process. Is that what you want? To throw away years of your career over a single case?" The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the distant hum of medical equipment and the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall, reminding them both that every second lost in this confrontation was 1 second less for Tommy. The ICU clock read 3:15 in the morning when Blake initiated the chelation protocol. The soft early morning light barely penetrated the blinds of the room, creating an almost intimate atmosphere, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors. Sarah watched every move the doctor made with wide eyes filled with hope and fear, her hands clasped in silent prayer as Blake prepared the first dose of the medication. "Doctor." Cameron checked Tommy's vital signs for the third time, ensuring he was stable enough to withstand the intensive treatment that was about to begin. Blake worked with the precision of a watchmaker, each motion calculated as he prepared the solution that, if all went well, would begin to flush the mercury from Tommy's system. The chelating medication, a specially developed compound designed to bind to heavy metals in the blood, dripped slowly through the IV tubing, each drop carrying with it the hope of reversing the damage the poison had inflicted over the months. The head nurse on duty meticulously recorded every vital parameter, knowing that the slightest change could mean the difference between success and failure. The treatment was a race against time. Mercury had been accumulating in Tommy's nervous system for months, perhaps years, and now they were attempting to reverse that damage in a matter of hours. Blake closely monitored the boy's reactions, his eyes alternating between the monitors and his young patient's pale face. Every minor change was noted, every fluctuation in vital signs analyzed. "Doctor." Cameron stood by the bedside, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of complication, while preparing the next dose of the medication. Sarah never left her son's side, her fingers gently stroking Tommy's hair as she whispered words of encouragement. Mrs. Johnson had brought her Bible, and read verses aloud in a hushed voice, her words mingling with the constant hum of the medical equipment. The ICU room had been transformed into a sanctuary where science and faith united in a desperate battle for a child's life. Blake, normally skeptical of spiritual matters, found himself strangely comforted by the atmosphere of devotion that permeated the room. The first hours of the treatment were the most critical. Tommy's body needed to accept the medication without reacting adversely, while the chelator began its work of capturing and eliminating the mercury from his system. Every member of the team knew their role with precision, a medical ballet choreographed where one mistake could have fatal consequences. Tommy's blood pressure was monitored every 15 minutes, his kidney function was constantly evaluated, and blood samples were collected at regular intervals to track mercury levels. In the dimness of the room, time seemed to move differently. Each minute dragged like an hour, each hour weighed like an entire day. Blake maintained absolute concentration, ignoring the fatigue that was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. This was the moment that would define not only Tommy's future, but also his own medical career. The unauthorized treatment could cost him his job, his medical license, everything he had worked for over the years. But as he watched the medication flow drop by drop into Tommy's body, Blake knew that some battles were worth any sacrifice. Suddenly, the cardiac monitors blared in a deafening chorus of alarms. Tommy's body began to convulse violently, his small limbs thrashing against the rails of the hospital bed as his blood pressure plummeted dangerously. Blake and his team moved instantly, transforming the room into a whirlwind of frantic activity. Sarah was gently pulled away from the bed by a nurse, her legs giving way as she fell to her knees, her crucifix clutched so tightly between her fingers that the knuckles of her hands turned white. The voice of Sarah rose above the chaos, her prayers mingling with Blake's urgent commands and the shrill sound of alarms. "My God, don't take my son. Please, not now," she pleaded, rocking back and forth in an anguished rhythm. "Mrs. Johnson knelt by her side, wrapping Sarah's trembling shoulders with one arm, as her own prayers joined the chorus of supplications. The sound of their voices created a harmony of faith and despair that contrasted dramatically with the clinical precision of the medical procedures being performed just a few meters away. Blake worked tirelessly, his mind processing dozens of possibilities, while his hands moved with practiced speed and accuracy. "Pressure dropping 50/30, Dr. Cameron alerted, her voice tense as she administered emergency medications. Tommy's heartbeats fluctuated dangerously, each irregular beep of the monitor, reminding everyone in the room how fragile the line between life and death they were trying to cross was. The boy's body was reacting violently to the treatment, and there was no guarantee they would manage to stabilize him. Sarah's prayers grew more intense, her voice choked with emotion as she recited biblical passages between sobs. "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Her words were interspersed with personal promises and pleas, the kind of desperate bargaining that only a mother on the verge of losing her child could make with the divine. Mrs. Johnson held her hand tightly, her own silent tears tracing paths down her weathered face as she continued to pray alongside Sarah. The minutes dragged like hours as the medical team fought to stabilize Tommy. Blake monitored the chelation levels in the boy's blood, knowing that stopping the treatment now would mean losing their only chance to flush the mercury from his system, but continuing could cost his patient's life. "Doctor." Cameron prepared another dose of emergency medication, her hands shaking slightly with adrenaline and fear. The sound of Sarah's prayers seemed to fill every corner of the room, creating an almost surreal atmosphere where science and faith vied for a child's fate. "Sats dropping," a nurse warned, her voice cutting through the prayers and chaos. Tommy's lips were beginning to take on a bluish tinge, an alarming sign that his body was losing the battle. Sarah raised her voice even higher, her words now almost a scream of pleading as she watched the scene through tear-blurred eyes. "Mrs. Johnson held her tighter, her prayers becoming a constant mantra echoing around the room. The moment was a macabre dance between hope and despair, with Tommy's life hanging by an ever-thinning thread. The first sign of change came from the heart monitor, its frantic rhythm gradually beginning to slow into a more regular pattern. Blake stood motionless before the monitors, his eyes fixed on the numbers that were starting to move in the right direction. barely daring to breathe as he watched each tiny fluctuation. Tommy's blood pressure initiated a slow but steady climb, the red digits blinking with a silent promise of hope. Color was returning to the boy's face, the bluish hue of his lips giving way to a pale but living pink. "Doctor." Cameron checked the vitals repeatedly, scarcely believing the recovery she was witnessing. Tommy's blood oxygen level rose consistently, the seizures had ceased, and his body seemed to finally accept the treatment it had so violently rejected moments ago. The rhythmic sound of the heart monitor filled the room with its steady cadence, like a soft melody replacing the cacophony of alarms that had dominated the atmosphere only moments before. Sarah lifted her eyes from her prayers, her tears now mingled with a glimmer of hope, as she watched the medical team's expressions shift from tension to cautious relief. The treatment that could have cost Tommy's life, and would certainly cost Blake his career, seemed to finally be working. The first blood test results, printed on sheets still warm from the lab printer, showed a decrease in mercury levels, the red numbers gradually giving way to values closer to normal. The chelator was doing its job, cleansing the boy's blood molecule by molecule, like a microscopic army in a silent battle against the poison. Blake slowly released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing minimally for the first time in hours. His eyes burned with the fatigue of a sleepless night, but remained fixed on the monitors, telling Tommy's recovery story in rhythmic beeps and undulating green lines. The ICU room, which had been the stage for a dramatic battle between life and death mere minutes ago, now emanated an almost sacred atmosphere of possibility and renewal. The heavy air of tension had dissipated, replaced by a lighter energy of hope. Sarah's prayers transformed into whispers of gratitude, her tears now glistening with relief instead of fear, as the numbers on the monitors continued their steady dance toward normalcy. The soft light of dawn beginning to filter through the blinds seemed to bring with it the promise of a new beginning. Blake had retreated to the small break area adjacent to the ICU, a space rarely used except by doctors and nurses, seeking a moment of peace during long, difficult shifts. The soft light of sunrise was beginning to spill through the single window, casting golden shadows on the bare walls. The doctor watched his untouched coffee, still mentally processing the events of the past hours, the crisis, the recovery, the risk he had taken. The distant sound of Tommy's heart monitor, now in a steady, reassuring rhythm, carried through the thin walls like a comforting melody. Nathan silently entered the enclosure, carrying 2 steaming cups of fresh coffee. Without saying a word, he replaced Blake's cold coffee with one of the cups and settled into the chair beside him. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small space, creating an almost meditative atmosphere. For a few moments, the 2 doctors remained in silence, sharing that moment of calm after the storm they had faced. The soft sound of the hospital awakening for another day filtered through the walls, blending with the low hum of the air conditioning. "I know you'll pretend you don't care," Nathan began, a soft smile playing on his lips as he observed the pensive profile of his colleague. "But you're relieved, aren't you?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with understanding and camaraderie built over years of working together. Blake took a sip of his coffee, still keeping his eyes fixed on a distant point through the window, but the slight relaxation in his shoulders and the almost imperceptible softening of his expression were answer enough for Nathan. The sunrise continued its slow progression across the horizon, marking the beginning of a new day, and for Tommy, a new chance at life. 3 days after the start of treatment, a small cry of pain echoed through the hospital room. Sarah, who had been dozing in the armchair beside the bed, awoke startled, only to find Tommy looking confused at his own arm, where a nurse had just removed a needle after collecting blood for tests. The sound, which would normally be cause for concern, made Blake's face light up with an expression of contained triumph. That brief moment of discomfort meant much more than pain. It was the first concrete sign that Tommy's nervous system was regenerating. The monitors around the bed now told a different story from the days before. Tommy's vital signs had completely stabilized, his blood pressure remained at normal levels, and blood tests showed a consistent decrease in mercury levels. The hospital room, which days earlier had been the scene of a desperate battle for life, now breathed an atmosphere of recovery and hope. The curtains were open, allowing natural light to flood the space. While the superhero drawings Tommy had resumed decorated the walls, their vibrant colors contrasting with the institutional white of the hospital. Dr. Cameron conducted a detailed neurological examination, testing Tommy's reflexes and sensitivity in different areas of his body. Each small complaint of discomfort, each whispered ouch when she touched certain points, was carefully noted in his chart. The boy, who previously showed no reaction to painful stimuli, now responded appropriately to each test. His eyes, once unfocused and confused, now followed the doctor's movements clearly, and his responses to questions were precise and coherent. The fog that had taken over his mind was dissipating, allowing Tommy's lively personality to emerge once again. Sarah watched each new development with a mixture of joy and disbelief, her prayers of supplication now transformed into fervent gratitude. Mrs. Johnson, who continued her daily visits, brought stories of the other children from the housing complex asking when Tommy would come back to play. The small hospital room had become a gathering point for a stream of love and support, with nurses who would stop by just to check on Tommy even when it wasn't their shift, and resident doctors who would pause to listen to his superhero stories, now told with the characteristic enthusiasm of a 7-year-old child. Blake maintained constant vigilance over Tommy's recovery, meticulously monitoring each new test. The results of the toxicology analyses showed a progressive reduction in mercury levels in his body, while neurological function tests indicated a recovery that, although gradual, was consistent and promising. The doctor who had risked his career to save a patient now observed with a rarely displayed satisfaction each small sign of improvement. The pain, which had been absent due to the poisoning, now returned as a welcome indicator of the ongoing cure. Tommy began to complain about the discomfort of medical procedures, something that made Sarah smile through tears of relief. "Mom, it hurts," he would protest during injections, his voice carrying that particular tone of childish indignation that seemed lost forever just weeks before. Each manifestation of pain was received by the medical team as a positive sign, proof that his nervous system was gradually regaining its normal functions. The boy who had once been unable to feel anything was now experiencing the world again in all its intensity, including the minor discomforts that were part of the healing process. The nights at the hospital, once marked by tense vigils and alarming monitors, were now filled with the soft sound of Tommy's peaceful breathing and the stories Sarah read to him before sleep. The soft glow of the bedside lamp created a cozy circle of comfort, while shadows danced gently across the walls of the room every time she turned a page. Outside, the city lights twinkled like earthly stars, creating an almost magical atmosphere for the superhero tales that Tommy loved so much. "And then Spider-Man leapt across the sky, saving the whole city," Sarah read, her melodious voice echoing softly through the room as Tommy fought against sleep, his heavy eyes blinking with determination to discover the end of the story. The Avengers blanket, which had witnessed moments of profound anguish, now served only to keep a boy warm as he dreamed of new adventures. The colorful drawings decorating the walls of the room seemed to come to life in the semi-darkness, as if the superheroes were standing guard over the peaceful sleep of their young artist. The distant sound of the hospital's corridors, nurses' soft footsteps making their rounds, the muffled murmur of nighttime conversations, the occasional clink of medical equipment, created a gentle symphony of normalcy that only highlighted the miracle of Tommy's recovery. The boy's recovery was not just a medical victory, it was a testimony to the strength of the human spirit, the persistence of a doctor who refused to give up, and the transformative power of a mother's faith who never lost hope, even on the darkest nights of illness. In Blake's office, away from the room where Tommy played with his drawings, Sarah wiped away tears that seemed endless. The sense of relief at her son's recovery mingled with a new wave of concern, as Blake explained the situation with a gravity that made her stomach tighten. The doctor had spread detailed reports about soil contamination at the Pine Grove housing complex across his desk, each page revealing a more alarming scenario than the one before. The afternoon light coming through the window felt colder as the reality of their situation began to set in. "Mrs. Miller, I need to be absolutely clear about this," Blake began, his voice carrying a weight Sarah had rarely noticed before. "Tommy cannot return to that environment. The soil is contaminated with dangerous levels of mercury, not just in the playground, but throughout the entire area. Every minute he spends there puts his life at risk again. Sarah gripped the strap of her purse with such force that her fingers ached, her mind spinning with the implications of those words. The apartment at Pine Grove was all she could afford on her waitress salary, and even then it was a constant struggle to keep up with the bills. The idea of finding another place to live in a city where rents were constantly rising seemed an impossible mountain to climb. The tears of relief she had shed moments before at Tommy's recovery now turned into drops of pure despair. "Dr. Blake, I have nowhere to go." Her voice trembled as she admitted the harsh reality of her situation. "I can barely afford the current rent and all the safer areas in the city." She couldn't finish the sentence, her throat closing with the anguish of the impossible situation she found herself in. Mrs. Johnson, who accompanied her as a silent pillar of support, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. But even that familiar gesture could not lessen the weight of the reality that lay before them. Blake rose from his chair and walked to the window, his silhouette outlined against the late afternoon light as he considered the situation. The distant sound of Tommy's laughter drifted through the hospital walls, a bittersweet reminder of what was at stake. "The treatment we performed," he continued, turning back to Sarah, "removed a significant amount of mercury from Tommy's system, but any new exposure could trigger an even more severe relapse. We cannot risk undoing all the progress we've made." Each word was like a stone added to the weight Sarah felt on her shoulders, the joy of her son's recovery gradually being overshadowed by the shadow of financial impossibility. Mrs. Johnson tried to offer some suggestions, relatives who might be able to help, social programs that could perhaps be consulted, but each option seemed as distant as the stars. Sarah thought of her practically non-existent savings, the hospital bills she would still have to face, the work time she had missed during Tommy's hospitalization. The future that should have been bright with her son's recovery now seemed like a maze with no exit. The office walls felt like they were closing in around her as she struggled to find a solution that simply did not exist within her limited means. "I can't just abandon my job and start over somewhere else," Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion as her restless hands crumpled a tear-soaked handkerchief. The afternoon light streaming through the office window cast elongated shadows that seemed to dance across the framed diplomas on the wall, silent witnesses to her anguish. "The restaurant is close to Pine Grove. I can walk, save on commuting. Anywhere else, the costs..." She paused, swallowing hard. "The rent would be higher. I'd need to take 2 buses, maybe even 3, not to mention the time away from Tommy." Her words trailed off into a stifled sob, the reality of her situation weighing heavier with each passing moment. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo the quickened pace of her troubled heart, while the soft hum of the air conditioning provided a melancholic soundtrack to her despair. "And there are the hospital bills. Even with the public plan, I'm already so deep in debt." Her voice failed her completely this time. Blake listened in silence, seated in his black leather chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the mahogany desk, his usually impassive face betraying signs of genuine concern. The doctor who had managed to save Tommy from death now found himself faced with a problem that could not be solved through medical procedures or medications. His years of study, his expensive specializations, all his scientific knowledge, none of it could help against the cruel socio-economic reality that presented itself. The solution needed reached far beyond the scope of medicine, venturing into a territory of social inequality and economic limitations that no diagnosis could correct. A soft knock at the office door interrupted the moment of silent despair. A middle-aged woman, dressed in a nondescript grey blazer and carrying a folder filled with documents, entered the room with purposeful strides. Her social services badge swayed gently as she approached Blake's desk. The local media had begun reporting on the contamination case at the Pine Grove housing complex, and Tommy's story had captured the attention of municipal authorities. The social worker's face bore that unique expression of someone bearing good news after a long bureaucratic battle. "Mrs. Miller," she began, her voice carrying a tone of hopeful urgency as she opened her folder on Blake's desk. "The case of Tommy has brought to light a situation that the authorities could no longer ignore. The government has just approved an emergency relocation program for all families residing in contaminated areas." Sarah, who mere seconds before was drowning in an ocean of despair, now clung to every word, as if they were life rafts being thrown in her direction. The social worker continued explaining the details of the program, spreading out forms and documents that promised a fresh start for not only Tommy and Sarah, but for the entire Pine Grove community. Blake's office, which moments ago seemed suffocating with the weight of impossibility, was now filled with an atmosphere of renewed hope. Mrs. Johnson squeezed Sarah's hand tightly, silent tears of relief streaming down both women's faces. Through the office window, the sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, as if nature itself celebrated this unexpected turn of fate for the Miller family. The distant sound of Tommy's laughter echoed through the hospital corridors, now carrying the promise of a safer, brighter future. Victoria Henshaw found Blake in the hospital corridor near the coffee machine he frequented so often. The natural light coming in through the large windows created a different atmosphere than usual, as if the very ambience of the hospital had changed after the events of the past few weeks. The director approached with measured steps, her demeanor carrying an expression Blake had never seen before, a peculiar mixture of administrative frustration and reluctant admiration. The usual hospital hubbub seemed to diminish around them, creating a bubble of privacy for this unusual moment. The report on the Pine Grove contamination is in all the local headlines, Henshaw began, nervously adjusting the folder she carried. The city council is being pressured to take action, and our hospital is being praised for the discovery. She paused, as if the next words were particularly difficult to pronounce. You were right about everything. The diagnosis, the treatment, the environmental origin of the problem. Her fingers drummed lightly on the folder, betraying her unease. But I can't ignore the fact that you broke virtually every hospital protocol. You disobeyed direct orders, performed unauthorized procedures, ignored the chain of command. Her voice carried the weight of institutional authority, even as she admitted Blake's victory. Blake watched his coffee cup with an apparently deep interest, an enigmatic smile emerging at the corner of his lips as Henshaw continued her list of infractions. Without saying a word, he simply discarded the empty cup, turned and began walking toward the exit. The smile on his face spoke louder than any verbal response could express, a mix of satisfaction at the life saved and a hint of amusement at the ironic situation. His footsteps echoed down the corridor as he walked away, leaving a momentarily speechless Henshaw, torn between irritation at his attitude and silent recognition that sometimes breaking the rules was necessary to do the right thing. Days later, Blake's apartment was bathed in a comfortable dimness, illuminated only by the bluish glow of the television and a single floor lamp in the corner of the living room. The doctor was sunk into his favorite leather armchair, a glass of aged Scotch whiskey in his hands, the amber liquid reflecting the images dancing on the screen. Night had settled over the city, and through the wide windows of his apartment, the urban lights created an artificial constellation that competed with the distant stars. On the television, a reporter was standing in front of the Pine Grove housing complex, the microphone firmly gripped as she reported the latest developments in the case that had captured the city's attention. After the discovery of mercury contamination in the soil of the Pine Grove housing complex, city authorities today announced a comprehensive basic sanitation project for the entire region. The footage showed technical teams conducting soil analyses, municipal workers coordinating cleanup operations, and residents being registered for the emergency relocation program. Blake took a sip of his whiskey, feeling the familiar warmth of the drink as he watched his latest case turn into concrete social change. The news continued, showing footage of families being transferred to new homes in safe areas of the city. Among them, Blake recognized Sarah and Tommy Miller carrying boxes to their new apartment. Tommy's face was lit up with that trademark smile that contrasted so sharply with the debilitated child who had arrived at the hospital weeks ago. The reporter mentioned that more than 50 families had already been relocated, with dozens more scheduled for the coming weeks. The emergency housing program, she said, had become a model for other cities facing similar situations of environmental contamination. The footage changed to a series of graphics and infographics detailing the sanitation project that would be implemented. The state government has approved a special budget for the complete decontamination of the area, the reporter explained, as numbers and statistics filled the screen. Experts estimate the process will take approximately 18 months, including the removal of contaminated soil, treatment of the area, and implementation of preventive measures to avoid future environmental problems. Blake poured himself another glass of his favorite drink, watching how a simple medical case had turned into an environmental and social revolution for an entire community. The news now featured interviews with Pine Grove residents. An elderly woman, who Blake recognized as a neighbor of the Millers, spoke about how Tommy's case had finally brought attention to issues the community had faced for years. Children played on a new temporary playground, installed in a safe area, while the old one underwent decontamination. The camera focused on smiling faces, relieved families, a community that finally saw hope after years of neglect. The reporter ended the segment with a note on how a single medical diagnosis had triggered a series of changes that would benefit future generations. What began as a medical case involving a child has turned into a movement of urban renewal and environmental justice, she concluded as the camera showed one last glimpse of the Pine Grove facade, now surrounded by construction equipment and work crews. Blake watched it all with an enigmatic expression, the glass of drink casually hanging from his fingers as the ice slowly melted, diluting the amber liquid just as time diluted the memories of the most intense moments of this extraordinary case. The story continued on the news, now showing images of Tommy in his new apartment, drawing superheroes at a study table near a clean, sunlit window. Blake kept his expression carefully neutral, as if watching just another wildlife documentary. The reporter was now interviewing Sarah Miller, who couldn't contain her tears of gratitude as she spoke about the change in their lives. Blake shifted in his armchair, feigning a discomfort that masked his own contained emotion. Her words echoed through the room. "My son has a future now, we all do." The doctor reached for the whiskey bottle, pouring himself another generous shot, as if the golden liquid could dilute the stubborn pride that threatened to break his facade of professional indifference. The ice clinked against the glass, an attempt to muffle the words that continued to flow from the television. The images changed to show other children from Pine Grove, all of them now living in safe and clean environments. Blake grabbed the remote control, his fingers toying with the volume button as if considering silencing that whole display of social impact his diagnosis had triggered. Another sip of whiskey went down his throat, trying to erase the smile that threatened to appear on his lips. The news now presented statistics on how the case had inspired similar investigations in other housing complexes in the city. Numbers and graphs danced across the screen, showing how many other lives could potentially be saved thanks to the precedent set by the Miller case. Blake feigned interest in a discarded medical article on his coffee table, as if the pages of scientific research were more relevant than the human impact of his work being displayed on television. Blake slightly increased the volume, pretending it was just to hear the technical details of the cleaning process better, and not the stories of hope and renewal that were being shared. His reflection in the window showed a man trying to maintain his reputation for emotional detachment, even when confronted with undeniable evidence of the good he had done. The sound of jingling keys and an opening door broke the contemplative atmosphere of the apartment. Nathan Ellis emerged from the dimness of the hallway, bringing with him the aroma of fresh coffee and a paper bag that suggested still warm donuts. He knew the building's entry code and Blake's schedules well, a familiarity built over years of working together. The bluish light from the television danced across the walls, casting moving shadows that seemed to accompany his steps as he approached the armchair where Blake remained seated, still feigning complete absorption in the newscast. The room was charged with that specific kind of silence that precedes important moments, broken only by the soft murmur of the television and the occasional clinking of ice in his glass. Nathan observed the scene for a moment. The half-empty bottle on the coffee table, Blake's eyes fixed on the screen where Tommy smiled in his new home, the almost imperceptible tension in his mentor's shoulders that betrayed his true emotions. The apartment, usually a monument to Blake's chosen solitude, felt different that night, as if the austere walls were witnessing a rare moment of vulnerability. "You can pretend you don't care," Nathan broke the silence, his voice carrying an unusual seriousness that contrasted with his customary playful tone. "But that kid is alive because of you, And now he has a future. The words hung in the air like smoke, dense with truths that usually remained unspoken between them. The television light illuminated Blake's profile, revealing micro-expressions his face normally wouldn't allow to slip through, a slight tremble at the corner of his mouth, a different glint in his eyes that he quickly tried to hide. The newscast continued its narrative, now showing images of the old playground being demolished, heavy machinery removing the contaminated soil that had nearly taken Tommy's life. Blake remained silent, his gaze fixed on the screen as if he were watching a movie in a language only he understood. Nathan didn't expect a response. He knew his colleague too well to expect any verbal admission of feelings. The silence between them was eloquent enough, charged with years of mutual understanding and respect that transcended the need for words. The final images of the newscast showed Tommy drawing in his new room, his superheroes now accompanied by a new figure, a white-coated doctor saving people. Blake watched the scene for a few more seconds, his face a studied mask of indifference that couldn't completely hide the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. With a deliberate motion, he reached for the remote and turned off the television, plunging the room into sudden dimness broken only by the soft glow of the corner lamp. Without saying a word, Blake rose from his armchair. His steps were firm as he headed out of the room, carrying with him that air of mystery that always accompanied him. Nathan watched his exit with a small smile of understanding. No words were needed to confirm what they both already knew. The dark hallway swallowed Blake's silhouette, but the environment he left behind vibrated with unexpressed emotions, with unabashedly uncelebrated victories, with the silent knowledge that sometimes saving a life meant far more than just a brilliant diagnosis. If Tommy and Sarah's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story that's now appearing on screen. Specially picked for you. See you soon.